I am going to tell you about the winter. My brother lost his mind over a foreign girl nobody wanted, and how the woman who arranged it all never once admitted she had done a single thing. My brother Callum is the Duke of Dunverin. He has been the Duke of Dunverin since he was 23 years old, when our father died and left him a Highland estate the size of a small country, a London townhouse, debts enough to ruin a lesser man, and a reputation so fearsome that titled mothers steered their daughters to the far side of every room he entered. He did not mind the steering. He did not, in those years, mind much of anything that did not concern the land, the tenants, the ledgers, or the cold management of an aristocracy that had never known quite what to do with a duke who came from the north, spoke his mind without ornament, and looked at a glittering ballroom the way other men looked at a bill they could not pay. I am his younger brother, Alistair. I have always been the easier one, or so I have been told. I smile more readily. I drink more freely. I have never once inspired a duchess to press her daughter behind a potted plant. I tell you this so you understand that when our grandmother sent her carriage to my lodgings on a gray Tuesday in November with a note that read only, "Come at once. Bring your good coat," I knew something was happening that would require me to be present, charming, and entirely invisible. Grandmother Elspeth, the Dowager Duchess of Dunverin, was 81 years old that winter. She had outlived 2 husbands, 1 war, a pestilence, 4 prime ministers she described as disappointments, and every prediction that she would soften in her old age. She had been beautiful in her youth, the portraits confirmed it, and had been formidable in her middle years, and had arrived at 81 in a state of absolute authority that did not require beauty or force of volume, because it operated on a deeper level than either. She was the size of a large sparrow and the force of a cavalry charge. When she decided something was going to happen, it happened. The only variable was whether the people involved understood this before or after the fact. She had loved my brother Callum since the day he was born, and she had been honest with him his entire life in the way that only grandmothers can be, without the constraints of parental hope or social propriety, and what she had said to him, more than once in the years since he became the Duke, was this: that he had inherited a title and an estate and a fearsome reputation, and had managed all 3 with distinction, and that the only thing she could identify that he had not managed was the simple human fact of being known by someone who was not obliged to know him. She said this without melodrama. She said it the way she said everything, directly, and then she moved on to something else, and left it sitting there for him to think about. She had been watching. That was what I understood, sitting in the drawing room that November, counting the teacups. She had been watching the city, watching the social calendar, watching the rooms that Callum moved through and failed to be found in, and she had been watching someone else as well. When I arrived at Dunverin House that Tuesday, the drawing room was set for tea with 3 places. I counted the cups. I looked at my grandmother. She was arranging biscuits with the studied innocence of a woman who had never arranged anything in her life without a stratagem. "Who's the 3rd cup for?" I asked. "A young woman," she said, "who is being eaten alive by this city and has no idea how to stop it." I sat down. I took a biscuit. I waited because with Grandmother Elspeth there was no other useful thing to do. Her name was Myra Vassinkov. She was the orphaned daughter of a Levantan diplomat and an English mother, both gone before she was 15, who had spent the years since in the care of her mother's distant cousin, a pinched and humorless woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who lived in Kensington and regarded Myra as a social liability she had agreed to house, but could not quite bring herself to love. Myra had arrived in England at 15 speaking 4 languages, and none of them quite in the way the drawing rooms of Mayfair expected. She was 24 now. She had been in London nearly a decade and had not, by any measure that society recognized, managed to belong to it. She was not, by those measures, the right sort of person. Her father's family was distinguished in its own country, which was not this country. Her mother's family was English enough but not well-connected enough and was gone besides. She had no portion, no patroness, no clear social category that Mayfair's rigid machinery could place her in and then comfortably proceed. What she had was her mind. But Mayfair did not particularly prize minds in women of uncertain station, which was why she spent her mornings translating academic papers for a scholarly press in Bloomsbury, and her evenings navigating the social calendar of a guardian who brought her to gatherings for reasons that had more to do with Mrs. Hartwell's own social positioning than with any genuine wish for Myra's welfare. I had seen her once before, though I had not known who she was. At Lady Pemberton's autumn dinner 3 weeks earlier, where a young woman near the far end of the table had quietly, precisely corrected the French ambassador's translation of a letter being read aloud, not loudly, not triumphantly, just accurately, and the room had gone cold in the specific way a room goes cold when someone has done something correct that no one wanted done. I remembered thinking she had beautiful dark eyes and very little sense of self-preservation. I had not thought about her again. I thought about her now, because she came through the drawing-room door with the posture of someone who has been told so many times to make herself smaller that she has become very good at walking as though she takes up no space at all, and Grandmother Elspeth rose from her chair, something she did for almost no one, and crossed the room and took both of Myra's hands in hers and said, "There you are. I have been wanting to properly meet you since Lady Pemberton's appalling dinner." Myra blinked. She had clearly been prepared for something other than warmth. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied, and it was a good curtsy, correct, not obsequious, and my grandmother made a small sound of approval that I recognized as high praise. "My grandson Alistair," Grandmother said, gesturing at me. "He's the harmless one." I shook the young woman's hand. She had a firm grip and a guarded expression, and she was watching my grandmother with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a situation they have not quite identified yet. Tea proceeded. My grandmother poured herself. She always poured herself, even now at 81, because she said that handing the task to another person introduced a variable she preferred to control. The tea was exactly right. She had been overseeing the making of it for 60 years, and the kitchen at Dunvarin House had long since stopped attempting to do it any other way. She asked Myra questions. Not the questions Mayfair asked, not who are your people and what is your portion and do you play, but actual questions, the kind that required actual answers. What languages did she read? What had she thought of the Pemberton dinner, and why had she corrected the ambassador so quietly? What did she do with herself in the mornings? Did she find London cold and Grandmother Elspeth meant not the weather? Myra answered everything. Carefully at first then, as it became apparent that no trap was being laid, with a directness that I found rather remarkable. She spoke Arabic and French and Italian and a fair amount of Russian, inherited from her father's postings. She had corrected the ambassador quietly because she had thought making a scene would embarrass him, and she had not wished to do that. She spent her mornings translating documents, academic papers, letters for a scholarly press in Bloomsbury, because Mrs. Hartwell's charity did not extend to pin money and she preferred to earn her own. She found London cold in every sense, yes, and she said it without self-pity, simply as a fact, the way you might report the weather. My grandmother listened to all of this with the expression of a woman whose hypothesis has been confirmed. "Tell me," she said at the close of tea, "have you been introduced to my grandson Callum, the Duke?" There was a pause, not a long one. But I saw the slight shift in Myra's expression, the wariness that settled over her features like a shutter being drawn. She knew the name. Everyone in London knew the name. The Duke of Dunvarin was not the sort of man whose name you did not know, even if you had only seen him at a distance. Too tall, too northern, too unhelpfully direct, with a look about him that suggested he found most of what was put in front of him either insufficient or mildly irritating. "Not formally," she said. "I have seen him at a distance." "And what did you think?" "That he looked as though he found the room disagreeable." My grandmother laughed. It was the laugh she reserved for people who had said something precisely true. "He does," she said. "He finds most rooms disagreeable. I am going to introduce you. Don't let him alarm you. He is not actually frightening. He is only northern and honest, and those things can appear the same." Myra said nothing. She looked at my grandmother with those careful dark eyes, and I had the distinct feeling she was doing the mathematics of the situation and arriving, correctly, at the conclusion that she had already agreed to something without being asked. She was right, but she came back. That was the thing. She could have made an excuse. She could have simply not come to the next gathering Grandmother Elspeth arranged, a small dinner, only 8 covers, at Dunvarin House the following Friday. She owed my grandmother nothing, had known her less than a week, and the invitation was for a gathering at which the Duke of Dunvarin would be present. She had every reason to decline, but she came. I think even then she did not entirely know why. Callum did not know she was coming. This was the first of my grandmother's stratagems and the most elegant. She told him only that it was a small dinner with people he needn't perform for, which was the one description guaranteed to bring him. He arrived in his usual state, impeccably dressed, profoundly unwilling to be sociable, scanning the room the moment he entered it with the look of a man calculating exits. He found the exits. He found the guests, Lord and Lady Caro, the Marchioness of Tewkesbury, myself, and one young woman he did not recognize sitting near the window with a book open in her lap, which she closed the moment the room began to assemble, with the quick, guilty motion of someone caught doing the thing they actually preferred. I watched my brother's eyes stop on her. Not long. A second, perhaps 2. Then he moved on, greeted our grandmother, took his place. But that stopping, that 2-second pause, was not something Callum did easily. He was a man who moved through social spaces with deliberate efficiency, and things that made him pause were things that had caught his attention genuinely, not merely by being novel. Dinner was arranged so that Myra was seated not beside Callum but across from him. My grandmother's placement was never accidental. She wanted him to be able to see Myra's face. The difficulty was that the Marchioness of Tewkesbury, who was seated on Callum's left, and who was one of those women who mistook relentless conversation for charm, did not stop talking for the first 2 courses, and my brother's expression went from neutral to the particular flatness it achieved when he was exercising significant restraint. The Marchioness had opinions about the new season's fashions, about the management of her country house, about the relative merits of 3 different positions on the matter of parliamentary reform, all of which she delivered with the cheerful certainty of a woman who had never once been contradicted to her face. Callum responded in monosyllables. He was too well-mannered to do otherwise. I watched him across the table. He was watching the conversation generally, that distant, monitoring quality he had at social events, taking in the room without appearing to. And once or twice I caught his gaze move to Myra with the brief specific quality of a man checking on something he has noticed and is not yet sure what to make of. It was during the fish course that it happened. The Marchioness was holding forth on the subject of foreign manners, the way they always seemed, she said, so inexplicably different from what one expected, as though the rest of the world had not quite managed to arrive at civilization. And she glanced down the table at Myra with a smile that was not a smile at all and said, "I imagine you find our customs rather overwhelming, coming from wherever it is you came from." The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when a cruelty has been committed in public, and everyone is waiting to see what the target does. Myra looked at the Marchioness. She set down her fork. She said in a voice perfectly pleasant and perfectly level, "I was raised partly in Beirut, partly in Rome, and partly in Vienna, my lady. I've found the customs in each city intelligible once one pays attention. I've been paying attention to London for 9 years. I find most of it quite comprehensible by now." Another silence. Then Callum said from across the table, "Which did you find the most comprehensible of the cities?" It was the first time he had spoken to her. His voice was what it always was, low, undecorated, carrying the slight roughness of the North, and he was looking at her with an expression I could not immediately read. It was not pity, which would have been the kind thing and also the wrong one. It was not sympathy in the soft form. It was interest direct and unperformed, the way Callum was interested in things when he was genuinely interested, which was rarely and completely. Myra turned her gaze to him. "Rome," she said without hesitation. "The rules were oldest there. Once you learned them, they didn't change. And London's rules change." "London's rules change," she said, "depending on who is watching." My brother looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly required. Then he picked up his wine glass. The Marchioness of Tewkesbury resumed talking about something else entirely, and the table recovered, and my grandmother, at the head of it, applied herself to her fish with the serenity of a woman who has just watched a chess piece move exactly where she intended. After dinner, the party divided in the usual way. I contrived to keep the other guests occupied, the Carrows with cards, the Marchioness with the portrait gallery, which she found endlessly fascinating on account of a minor ancestor who had apparently met someone notable at some point, and my grandmother, who required no contriving from anyone, simply settled herself near the fire in the drawing-room and said to Callum, "Sit with me a moment," which meant the evening was over for him socially, and he obeyed gratefully. Myra had moved to the far end of the room, near the bookcase. She was not pretending to look at the books. She was actually looking at them, running her fingertip along the spines with the attention of someone who reads as a genuine occupation and not a social performance. My grandmother said to Callum quietly, "Go and ask her what she's found." He looked at grandmother, then he looked at Myra, then he said, "I'm not going to pretend I wandered over there by accident. I don't wander." "Then don't pretend," grandmother said. "Walk over there on purpose." He did. I watched him cross the room, my brother, who did not wander, who did not hover, who moved through social spaces like a man passing through them on his way somewhere else, and stopped beside Myra at the bookcase with the air of a man who has decided to do a thing and is now doing it. He said something I could not hear. She looked up at him. Whatever she said made his expression shift slightly, not softer exactly, but different. Less defended, perhaps, he replied. She replied. He reached past her and pulled a slim volume from the shelf and handed it to her, and she took it, and looked at the spine, and said something that made the corner of his mouth move. It was not a smile, not quite, but it was the fault line where one might begin. I went to refill my drink. When I looked back, they were still talking. The Carrows were absorbed in their card game. The Marchioness was admiring a portrait of our great-great-uncle with an attention he did not deserve. My grandmother, beside the fire, was attending to her embroidery with absolute innocence. I said to her very quietly, passing her chair, "You are a menace." She said without looking up, "I am a grandmother. It is the same thing." The stratagem did not end there. It would have been unlike grandmother Elspeth to achieve something in a single evening and consider it done. The dinner was a beginning, a crack in a door, and what she needed next was time. She arranged time the way other people arranged flowers, with apparent casualness that concealed exact intention. There was a musicale the following week at which Myra happened to be present, because my grandmother had written to Mrs. Hartwell that a place had opened for her ward, which it had, because grandmother Elspeth had created the place by the simple method of informing the hostess that she wished one to exist. There was a lending library visit. My grandmother was too elderly to manage the stairs alone, she said, and she had asked Myra to accompany her, as her French was so excellent and she needed help with a catalogue. There was an afternoon at Dunvarin House ostensibly to discuss the translation of certain family papers from the French, a task that required Myra's presence and produced, as a side effect, the presence of Callum, who worked in his study directly below the library and came upstairs for a book and stayed for 40 minutes, because the conversation he encountered was more interesting than whatever he had planned to do with the book. He told me about that afternoon himself. We were riding in the park 3 days later, and he said, without preamble, in the way he said everything, "Grandmother's been arranging things." "Has she?" I said. "You know she has." He looked at me. "You're part of it." "I'm never part of anything," I said. "I merely turn up." He made a sound that was not quite disagreement. We rode in silence for a moment. The park was nearly empty at that hour, a cold morning, the paths frosty, the trees stripped to their frames. My brother rode with the same quality he had in rooms, contained, deliberate, a man spending himself precisely. He had ridden since boyhood, was at home on a horse in a way he was rarely entirely at home anywhere else, and in the saddle the northern quality came out in him most clearly. The long patience, the preference for silence over speech, the way he attended to the animal beneath him and the ground ahead with the unhurried focus of a man who was not performing anything for anyone. It was this quality I had always thought that Mayfair found most unnerving about him. London preferred men who performed. It preferred animation, the social machinery of wit and gesture, the performance of ease. Callum produced none of it. He was simply present, completely and without decoration, and people who were themselves largely decorative tended to find that unsettling. Then he said, "She speaks Russian better than I expected. The girl, Myra." "You were discussing Russian in the library." "There was a letter in the family papers, from a posting in St. Petersburg, 18th century, an ancestor of ours evidently who spent 2 years there and found the experience. He used a word I had to ask her to translate because even his French was contaminated by whatever he'd picked up in that city. She read it without stopping." He paused. "And then she told me the word in 3 other languages, and what it lost in each one." I said nothing. I had learned, watching my grandmother operate, that the most useful thing one can do when someone is working their way towards something they have not yet admitted is to leave room for them to arrive at it themselves. Callum looked at the path ahead. "She doesn't try to manage me," he said. It sounded like an observation, but it was something more than that. My brother had been managed or attempted since the day he inherited the title. By matchmaking mothers, by political allies, by merchants who wanted favorable terms, by women who smiled at him in ballrooms with the fixed brightness of people who had decided he was a problem to be solved. He had found none of it agreeable. "She just says what she thinks, and waits to see what I do with it." "Alarming quality in a person," I said. "Yes," he agreed, and then after a pause, "No, not alarming." I let that sit. It sat well. The trouble came, as trouble always does in these stories, from the people who had decided what was appropriate and were prepared to defend it loudly. It was Lady Caro, the same Lady Caro who had been perfectly pleasant at my grandmother's dinner, who began it, at a reception at the Tewkesbury townhouse in early December. She was speaking to Mrs. Hartwell, who was present with Myra, and she was speaking in the carrying voice of a woman who does not intend to be overheard but does not particularly mind if she is, and what she was saying was this: that it was well enough for the Dowager Duchess to take up charitable causes, but that there were limits to what even charity could accomplish, and that certain young women, however clever, she paused on clever, in a way that drained the word of every compliment, simply were not the sort, and that one hoped the Dowager Duchess would not find herself embarrassed by an association that had formed, perhaps, without full consideration of what it signified. She said the sort, the way people say it when they mean a great many specific things and prefer not to name any of them directly, because naming them would require a precision they are not willing to be held to. What she meant was foreign. What she meant was no family. What she meant was has been in this city for 9 years and has not attached herself to anything, which in Mayfair's understanding meant there was nothing to attach to. Mrs. Hartwell said nothing. This was her habit. She neither defended Myra nor actively joined the attack, which was a species of cruelty all its own, because it preserved Mrs. Hartwell's position while offering Myra none. Myra, who was standing near the window and had heard every word, turned to look out at the street. Her face was composed. Her hands, I noticed, were very still. People who are accustomed to being spoken about learn a particular stillness. They learn it young and they become expert at it, and it is the saddest expertise I know. I was across the room and saw it, and I felt the sharp, specific irritation of a younger brother who cannot act on his elder's behalf without first knowing his elder's feelings, and did not know them, not yet, not precisely. Callum was not there that evening. He did not attend Tewkesbury events as a rule, on the grounds that the rooms were too warm, the conversation too thin, and the wine not worth the trouble. But my grandmother was, and she had heard Lady Carrow's carrying voice as clearly as I had. She said nothing that evening. She did not look at Lady Carrow. She crossed the room to Myra and said simply, "Come and sit with me." And Myra came and sat with her, and they talked about something else entirely. The musicale from the previous week, a concert planned for February, a translation of Byzantine poetry that someone had published and my grandmother had found unexpectedly fine, and Myra's hands, over the course of 10 minutes, became less still and more natural. Lady Carrow, across the room, found she had very little audience for her opinion after that, because my grandmother had quietly absorbed the only person worth talking to into a conversation that was visibly and entirely superior. Afterward in the carriage, my grandmother said to me, "It's time to move faster." I said, "Does Callum know that?" She said, "He will." What she meant, I learned the next morning when she visited him at his study and told him, without embellishment, what had been said at the Tewkesbury reception. She was not dramatic about it. She was specific. She laid it before him the way you lay a document before a man who is capable of reading and let him read it. I was not present for this conversation, but I know my brother. I know the particular quality of his silence when something has touched a nerve that runs deeper than he expected, because I have watched him his whole life, and I know that the silences are where Callum keeps everything that matters. He came to find me that afternoon. He said, "Where does she spend Tuesdays?" I said, "Who?" He said, "Don't." I said, "The Bloomsbury Press. She translates until midday. Then she takes her luncheon at a tea room on Museum Street." He went there on the following Tuesday. Not to sweep in and announce anything. That was not how he operated, and she would not have wanted it if it were. He simply went, and found her at a small table with a cup of tea and a document she was working through in pencil, and he asked if he might sit, and she looked at him with those careful dark eyes, calculating, and said yes, and he sat and ordered tea, and they talked for an hour and a half. I know what they talked about because he told me some of it later, and she told my grandmother some of it, later still, and between the two accounts I have assembled a picture that I believe is largely accurate. They talked about the family papers she had been translating, about the history buried in correspondence, the way you could reconstruct a whole person from the letters they sent in moments of difficulty. A man could present himself as entirely capable in person and come apart entirely in a letter written at 3 in the morning, and the letter was the truer document. My brother found this interesting in the way he found things interesting when they connected to something he had already been thinking about and had not found language for. He had been thinking, he told me later, about what it meant to be known accurately, not the version of himself that Mayfair had assembled from his title and his silences and his northern bluntness, but the actual working version that existed in the gaps between the public appearances. He had not been thinking it consciously, but when Myra said it about the letters, he recognized the thing he had been circling. The tea room on Museum Street was not a fashionable establishment. It was warm and slightly worn, with mismatched cups and a view of the street, and the kind of unhurried atmosphere that belonged to people who came to think rather than to be seen. Myra had clearly been coming here for some time. The woman at the counter knew her order. Callum noticed this. He noticed the small signals of a life that had its own interior logic, its own established patterns, its own small loyalties. It was not the life Mayfair would have given her, because Mayfair had not given her much of anything. But it was hers, and it was real, and he found that he respected it. They talked about Russia, about Rome, about what it felt like to be somewhere that was not quite home, and whether that feeling ever resolved or whether one simply became accustomed to carrying it. Callum, who had spent the first years of his dukedom feeling that London was a foreign country he was obliged to inhabit, said something on this subject that she apparently found so precisely right that she put down her pencil and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He told me he had not minded the silence. He had found it, he said, and this was extraordinary coming from Callum, who measured words the way other men measured gold. He had found it the most comfortable silence he could remember sitting in. They talked about the Bloomsbury Press, about the peculiarities of academic translation, about the Byzantine poetry my grandmother had mentioned. She had read it. She had opinions about the translation's weaknesses that were specific and technical, and that he followed with more attention than most men would have managed, and told her so, and she had looked at him with the slight surprised expression of someone who has been paid a compliment so undecorated that it takes a moment to recognize it as one. After that Tuesday, things moved at a different pace, not a declared pace, not an official one, but December in London has a social calendar that provides a natural rhythm of occasions, and Callum, who had for years attended the minimum required by duty, began to attend rather more than the minimum. He appeared at the charity concert my grandmother had mentioned to Myra. He appeared at a small supper given by Lord Carow, which was perhaps the more remarkable choice given what his wife had said, though Callum's expression upon greeting Lady Carow was such that she spent the rest of the evening speaking very carefully about subjects unlikely to require qualification. He and Myra were not, in any of these settings, demonstratively anything. They were two people who happened to talk when they found themselves near each other, and who happened to find themselves near each other rather frequently. If you were watching, and I was watching, and so was my grandmother, and so, eventually, was everyone, you could see it. The way a room with both of them in it had a different quality. The way he tracked her from across a room without appearing to, moving through conversations with the distracted quality of a man who is listening to two things at once, and one of them is more important. The particular attention he gave to whatever she was saying, focused, real, as though what she said was the most interesting thing in the room, because to him it was. She was more guarded. I do not say this as a criticism. A woman in her position learns to be guarded. She had been offered warmth before by Mayfair, intermittently, when it suited someone's purpose, and had found that the warmth had terms she had not been informed of in advance. She was careful with Callum in the way you are careful with something that looks valuable, and you are not yet sure you are allowed to touch. She kept her responses measured. She did not lean into conversations. She inhabited them precisely, taking up the exact amount of space the exchange required and no more. But there were moments. At the charity concert, the pianist played a particular passage from an Italian composer, and I watched Myra's face change when the melody began, a subtle softening, the kind of expression people wear when a piece of music has a personal history attached to it, when it is not music anymore but time. Callum, sitting beside her, noticed everything, and leaned slightly toward her and said something very low, and she turned to him and answered. And for a moment they were somewhere else entirely, both of them. Somewhere the Marchioness of Tewkesbury and Lady Carow and Mrs. Hartwell, and the entire apparatus of English aristocratic judgment could not follow. That was the Tuesday, the Wednesday, the concert. The slow accumulation of ordinary time in each other's company that is, in the end, the only thing that actually works. There is no shortcut to it. My grandmother knew this, which was why she had arranged rooms, not a single dramatic encounter but a series of ordinary ones, because ordinary time reveals what performance conceals, and what Callum and Myra needed to find in each other was not a performance. The crisis came from Mrs. Hartwell. I will try to be fair to her. She was not a cruel woman precisely. She was a calculating one, which is different, and in some ways worse, because calculation has intentions and intentions can be called to account. She had housed Myra for 9 years. She had done it without love but without obvious malice. She had fed her and clothed her and brought her into society at the price of Myra's own particular invisibility, which Mrs. Hartwell had found convenient because an invisible ward does not complicate a household. When it became apparent, as it became apparent to everyone in Mayfair by mid-December, because Mayfair is incapable of not noticing things, and even more incapable of not speculating about them, that the Duke of Dunvarron was spending what appeared to be a significant and sustained amount of social time in Myra's vicinity, Mrs. Hartwell recalculated. The recalculation produced the following. A young woman in one's care who attracts the attention of a feared and powerful duke is either an asset or a threat, depending on whether you can manage the outcome. If she becomes his duchess, you are associated with it, and there is social credit to be had. If she merely embarrasses you by reaching above her station and failing, you are exposed to whatever Mayfair makes of that failure. Mrs. Hartwell preferred to manage outcomes. She preferred, above all, to preserve her own position. What she did was subtle. She invited Callum to call directly, formally, in a note that was carefully worded to suggest that she, as Myra's guardian, wished to discuss the young woman's situation and welfare. He came, because ignoring such a note would have been impolite in a way that reflected on Myra, and he was aware by then that things reflecting on Myra tended to matter to him. And Mrs. Hartwell, over tea in her correct Kensington drawing-room, managed to convey, in the specific language of a woman who has practiced saying things without saying them, the following: that Myra was a complicated case, that her background, while not disgraceful, was not what one would have chosen, that she had always tried to do her best for the girl, but that she was aware of the limits of what even the best intentions could accomplish, and that she was aware that certain situations could place a person, a powerful person, a duke, for instance, in a difficult position that he might not have fully considered before allowing himself to become, shall we say, associated. She did not say Myra was unsuitable. She did not say he should stop. She simply arranged the relevant facts, the foreign name, the uncertain background, the 9 years of social inconsequence, in a careful row in front of him, and invited him to draw his own conclusions, which is the method most likely to make a conclusion stick, because a man who has arrived at it himself believes he has found it rather than been given it. I learned about this conversation from Callum himself that evening, when he appeared at my lodgings unannounced and stood in my sitting room with his coat still on, which was unlike him. He was still wearing it. He had not registered the fact. I said, "What happened?" He told me. Then he said, "She's been doing it for 9 years." I said, "Managing her. Making her feel like a problem to be endured." He said it quietly, the way he said the things that had gone somewhere that mattered, that had found the nerve. She told me, Mrs. Hartwell, as though it were kindness, as though she were doing me a service by pointing it out, as though the complicated background and the foreign name and the 9 years of being nobody's first priority were reasons to— He stopped. He looked at the fire. "She's not a problem," he said. "She's the most interesting person I have spoken to since I cannot remember when, and she translates Russian at sight, and she corrects French ambassadors because they're wrong and it would be worse to let them be wrong, and she has been sitting in rooms for 9 years being told to make herself smaller, and she has refused to. She has been precise and direct and entirely herself, in a city that has given her no particular reason to be, and that woman sat there in her Kensington drawing-room and handed me all of that as though it were a liability. I said nothing. I was not required to say anything. My brother was arriving somewhere and it would have been wrong to hurry him. He said, "I'm going to speak to grandmother." He did that night. And my grandmother, who had been waiting for precisely this conversation with the patience of a woman who has been waiting for things her entire life, and has learned that waiting is not the same as doing nothing, listened to everything he said, and then asked him one question. She said, "What is it you want, Callum?" He said, "I want to marry her." My grandmother set down her embroidery. She said, "Then you had better tell her." And Alistair stopped hovering in the hallway. I had not been hovering. I had been standing very still near the door. The difficulty, the remaining and real difficulty, was that Myra did not know any of this. She did not know about Mrs. Hartwell's conversation with Callum. She did not know what Callum had said to our grandmother. She knew only what she could observe, that the Duke of Dunvarron had been spending time in her company, that this had attracted notice, and that notice in Mayfair attached itself to a woman in her position, the way consequences attach to choices you haven't quite made yet. She was, I think, bracing for the cost, for the attention to carry a bill she had not yet been presented with. She was 24 years old and had been in London 9 years, and she knew the way this city worked. On a Friday morning in the 3rd week of December, Callum came to the Bloomsbury Press. He did not come at the luncheon hour. He came at 10 in the morning when she would be working. He asked to speak with her and was told she was occupied with a translation and could not be interrupted, and he said he would wait. And he waited for 40 minutes in the entrance hall, sitting on a wooden chair that was not designed for a man his size, with the patience of a man who has decided to do something and will do it when the moment is right. She came out eventually, with her pencil still in her hand and her document under her arm and the slightly distracted expression of someone pulled out of deep work, and she found him standing. He had risen the moment she appeared, and whatever she had expected, it was not this. He said, "I need to speak with you. Not here, would you walk with me?" She looked at him. She said, "Is something wrong?" He said, "No, I hope not." "Will you come?" They walked. I know this from my grandmother, who had it from Myra, who told her sometime in January, sitting by the fire in Dunvarron House with the ease of a woman who has at last found the room that is entirely hers and requires no management of her own smallness. He told her about Mrs. Hartwell's conversation. He was careful with the telling, precise, not dramatic, and careful of the places that would wound her most, but he thought she deserved to know that someone had attempted to use her history against her. And then he told her that it had not had the effect Mrs. Hartwell had intended, that the relevant facts, in his view, were not the ones Mrs. Hartwell had arranged in her drawing room. She listened. She did not interrupt. She was very good at listening, one of those people who gives the speaker the full and accurate sense of being heard, which is rarer than it ought to be. When he finished, she said, "What are the relevant facts in your view?" He said that I have not looked forward to a Tuesday in some years, and I have begun to look forward to Tuesdays. She said nothing for a moment. They were walking along the edge of the park. The December light was low and pale, and the city was making its usual noise around them, entirely indifferent to what happened in its margins. She said, "I have not had a great many things that were simply mine, in this city, things that were not contingent on something else." He said, "I know." "I don't want to borrow anything," she said. "I don't want to be an arrangement. I've been an arrangement for 9 years. I don't want another one, however different." He stopped walking. He turned to look at her. He said, "I'm not proposing an arrangement. I am telling you that I find you, and here," she told my grandmother. He paused, and she could see the effort it cost him, because Callum did not say things he had not fully decided, and the fully deciding took the time it took. "I find you more necessary to a room than anyone in it. I find that Tuesdays have acquired a quality that no other day of the week has managed. And I would like, if you are willing, to make that official." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that a less steady man might have taken it for refusal and retreated. Callum did not retreat. He looked back. The way he looked at things he intended to understand. She said, "You should know that Mrs. Hartwell will claim it as her doing." He said, My grandmother will argue the point vigorously." And Myra laughed, not carefully, not with the checking quality, not with the slight held-backness she brought to every room in the city. She laughed freely, and it was, by every account I have, my grandmother's, mine, and eventually Callum's own, the first time any of them had heard that sound from her without the guard in front of it. He looked at her when she laughed the way a man looks at something that has just become irreplaceable. The engagement was announced at the New Year's gathering Grandmother Elspeth hosted at Dunvarin House, which was attended by rather a large number of people, because my grandmother had issued invitations with the cheerful authority of a woman who expected compliance, and received it from everyone except the one person she had not invited. Mrs. Hartwell received no invitation. The omission was so precise it could only have been intentional, which it absolutely was, and my grandmother, when I mentioned it, said only that she had a limited number of chairs and had allocated them carefully. Lady Carrow was present. The Marchioness of Tewkesbury was present. Lord Carrow, who was a reasonable man and had always found his wife's opinions somewhat in excess of the evidence, was present and seemed quietly pleased by what the evening was building toward. My grandmother made the announcement herself, rising from her chair by the fire at the stroke of 10, with the assembled company arranged around her in the candle-lit splendor of Dunvarin House. The room was warm. The chandelier was brilliant. The guests had been fed well and given excellent wine, which was my grandmother's method of ensuring a benevolent atmosphere for news she intended to land without resistance. She was small and white-haired and 81 years old, and she commanded the room the way she commanded every room she had ever entered in her life, which was absolutely, without raising her voice, simply by speaking in the tone that indicated the conversation was now happening and the rest of the noise had become irrelevant. She said that she wished to introduce, formally, the woman who would become the Duchess of Dunvarin, and she said Myra's name, her full name, given and family both, the whole of it, all 4 syllables of the family name that London had spent 9 years mispronouncing or not bothering with, in the carrying voice she used when she wished to ensure that every person present understood that what was being said was final and not subject to subsequent qualification, and Callum, standing beside her, offered his arm to Myra, who took it, and the room, that glittering, careful, calculating room that had spent 9 years producing a studied, insufficient version of its attention in her direction, looked. It looked fully, it looked all at once. And what it saw was my brother, the Duke of Dunvarin, feared, northern, formidable, the man who scanned rooms for exits, standing with the specific and entirely unguarded expression of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for, and is not even slightly inclined to pretend otherwise. And Myra beside him, not small, not careful, not making herself a convenient shape. She was standing the way she had been unable to stand in any room in the city for 9 years, simply, directly, upright, as though she were allowed to be exactly where she was, because the most feared man in the room had made it plain and his grandmother had made it official, and the two of them together were more than enough for every carrying voice and careful sneer the city had managed to produce in her direction. Lady Carrow said something to the woman beside her, quietly. I did not hear it. I do not believe it was congratulatory. I believe it was the kind of thing people say when they have lost an argument they did not realize they were having, because they did not realize it was an argument until the verdict was announced. It did not matter. Dunvarin House was not Lady Carrow's room. It was my grandmother's room, and then it was Myra's, and the two of them combined made it a space in which Lady Carrow's opinion was simply not a governing fact. I refilled my drink. I caught my grandmother's eye across the room. She was applying herself to her embroidery again with absolute composure, in the manner of a woman who has accomplished a significant thing and has no intention of discussing it. I raised my glass to her. She inclined her head very slightly, in the manner of a woman accepting a compliment she considers no more than her due. In February, they were married at the family chapel in Dunvarren, which is a small stone building that has stood in the Highland Hills for 400 years, and has seen every kind of weather and every kind of ceremony, and has outlasted all of them with the quiet confidence of something that was built to last and knew it. It was a cold day. The hills were white. Inside the chapel the candles had been lit since morning, and the stones held a warmth that was older than any of us, a warmth that came from 400 years of people meaning what they said inside those walls. My grandmother sat in the front pew. She had chosen her dress carefully, deep blue, the color she had always worn for important occasions, and she sat with her hands folded and her back straight with the composure of a woman who has arranged precisely this outcome, and is entirely at peace with the arrangement. Myra came down the aisle in cream silk, her dark hair dressed simply with a few small winter flowers, her spine straight, her eyes on my brother from the moment she appeared in the doorway. There was nothing tentative about how she walked. She did not look at the guests. She did not look at the stones or the candles or the extraordinary Highland winter light coming through the old narrow windows. She looked at Callum, who was standing at the altar, and he looked at her, and the whole complicated machinery of this city, the drawing rooms, the careful opinions, the carrying voices, the 9 years of managed smallness, was simply not present in that room. He watched her come to him. He watched her all the way down the aisle, and when she reached him and took her place beside him, he said something to her quietly before the ceremony began, something I could not hear from the second pew. She smiled, not carefully, not with the checking first quality she had brought to every room in London, just smiled and turned to face the altar, and the service began. I looked at my grandmother. She was looking at Callum and Myra with an expression I had seen on her face only a handful of times in my life, a satisfaction so deep it had gone past anything so small as pride. It was the expression of someone who has understood something important about two people long before either of them understood it about themselves, and has been patient enough, and strategic enough, and loving enough, to arrange the conditions under which they could find it out. They read their vows in the old form, the words that have been worn smooth by centuries of use and are not diminished by it. The way certain truths are not diminished by being said often, but rather confirmed. My brother said his in the voice he used for things that were entirely serious, which was not very different from his normal voice, but was different in the way that matters, completely and without reservation. Afterward, in the cold winter sun outside the chapel doors, with the snow coming down in the soft, unhurried way it does in the Highlands when it has all the time in the world, I stood next to my grandmother and watched Callum tuck Myra's hand into the warmth of his arm, and she leaned into him, not dramatically, not as a performance, just naturally, the way you lean into somewhere that has become yours, and they walked together toward the house, talking, and I could not hear what they were saying. But I could see that it was easy, and that ease, after 9 years of the opposite of ease, was the most significant thing. I said to my grandmother, "You planned this from the first tee." She said, "I simply arranged for 2 people to be in the same room." I said, "You arranged for them to be in approximately 16 rooms." She said, "Some people require more rooms than others." I said, "You are the most dangerous woman I have ever known." She said, "Yes," without any particular modesty, and tucked her hand into my arm, and we followed them in out of the snow. I have been asked in the years since by those who were there, by those who wish they had been, by those who have heard the story and want to understand it, what it was that made it work. The grandmother's scheme, the Tuesday lunches, the library afternoons, the concert, the snow. I think it is simpler than any of that, or rather it is the thing underneath all of that, which is this. My brother had spent years in a world that wanted something from him, and Myra had spent years in a world that wanted her to want less than she was, and they had found each other. Not because my grandmother arranged rooms, though she did, and credit where it is due, but because in every room she arranged, the thing that happened was the same. Two people talked to each other as though the other one was real, and found that they were. She told me once, Myra did years later, on one of my visits to the Dunverin estate, over tea in the library where the old family papers still lived in their folders, and she had long since finished translating every one of them, and had moved on to a project of her own, a history of the estate she was compiling from the correspondence. She told me that what she remembered from the first dinner was not my brother's face or his voice, or even what he had said. What she remembered was that he had asked a question and then waited for the actual answer, not for the answer he expected, not for the answer that would have been convenient or pleasing, the actual answer with his full attention as though he had time, as though her answer was the thing he was there for. In 9 years in this city, she said, very few people had done that. My brother, who was sitting across from her with a book, looked up at this and said, "That seems like very few people's loss." She said, yes, it was. And she went back to her writing, and he went back to his book, and outside the windows the Highland hills were green in the summer light, and the chapel was white and patient in the middle distance, and the family papers were all translated now, every letter, every voice recovered and restored and properly its own, and nothing in that room required anyone to be smaller than they were. I finished my tea. I thought about my grandmother, who had died the previous winter at 83, in her own bed in the middle of a sentence, which was, everyone agreed, exactly as she would have arranged it if she had been arranging things, which she always was. I thought about the day she had risen from her chair, for almost no one. She rose for almost no one and crossed the room and taken Myra's hands and said, "There you are." As though she had been expected, as though the city had simply not gotten around to noticing yet, as though it was only a matter of time, and the right rooms, and someone with enough patience and enough love to arrange them. I set down my cup. Outside the hills went on, green and enormous and entirely indifferent to what Mayfair thought about anything. I was very glad my grandmother had sent the carriage that November. I was very glad I had brought my good coat. I have one more thing to tell you, because it belongs to the story, and I would feel the shape of it was wrong without it. 3 weeks after the wedding, a letter arrived at Dunverin House from Mrs. Hartwell. I was visiting that afternoon and happened to be in the library when Callum brought it to Myra, still sealed, with the expression of a man who knows what is in a room before he enters it. He handed it to her without comment. She looked at the handwriting on the front, then at him. "You don't have to read it," he said. She said, "I know." She broke the seal. I pretended to be very interested in a volume of Highland genealogy while she read. It did not take long. When she set the letter down, her expression was the composed one, the still hands one. But it was not the same as before, because before it had been a stillness against something that was still happening, and now it was a stillness after something that had already been resolved. She said, "She wishes me well, and says she always knew it would come right." Callum said, Myra said, "She has enclosed a small gift and says she considers herself something of a guiding hand in the matter." My brother looked at my grandmother's portrait above the fireplace for a moment. Then he said, "We should send a reply." Myra said, "We should send a polite reply." "Yes," he said, "I'll write it." She looked at him. She said, "Are you certain you should write it? You are not, your style is not perhaps the most." "I'll be polite," he said. "You will intend to be polite," she said. "There is sometimes a gap." I set down the genealogy. I said, "I'll write it." They both looked at me. I said, "I am widely regarded as the diplomatic one. This is literally the situation I exist for." Myra laughed. Callum made the sound that was not quite disagreement, and the letter that went to Mrs. Hartwell was gracious and warm and said nothing at all about guiding hands, and I wrote every word of it, and I think it was some of my finest work. That was the beginning of the life. Not the wedding, not the announcement, not the November tea with 3 cups, but that ordinary afternoon in the library, the 3 of us, the letter on the table, the portrait of my grandmother above the fire, and Myra's laugh filling the room like something that had always been meant to be there, and had simply been waiting for the right house. The right house had found her. That was all. And it had taken a grandmother, 16 rooms, 40 minutes on a wooden chair, and the accumulated Tuesdays of a cold December to do it, but it had found her, and that was enough, and it was everything.